The rain had not stopped since dawn, a steady curtain of cold tapping against the windows of Riverside Cafe, a modest little joint tucked between a pharmacy and a laundromat on the corner of 4th and Maple in Eugene, Oregon. By 11 a.m., the place had transformed into a whirlwind. Coffee mugs clinked in rapid-fire rhythm, the receipt printer spat out orders faster than anyone could grab them, and the line at the register snaked past the entrance like it had no intention of shortening. Inside, the smell of bacon grease, burnt toast, and French roast coffee mixed into a scent locals either loved or learned to live with. The hum of conversation grew louder, the kitchen's clatter grew sharper, and patience had already started wearing thin. Tasha Melrose, 29 and running on 3 hours of sleep, moved through the chaos like a figure skater dodging flying pans. Her sneakers were soaked through from her walk to work, her damp apron stuck to her waist from the iced tea she'd spilled on herself earlier, and her hair, pulled into a frazzled ponytail, was still dripping slightly from the rain. But none of it mattered. Table 6 was asking about their missing fries again. A to-go order was half-packed and waiting to be boxed. Booth 3 had 2 toddlers screaming as if auditioning for the next horror flick, and someone in the back corner had just snapped their fingers for more ranch like she was a dog. Still, Tasha smiled, nodded, and kept moving. She had learned to survive the daily madness through efficiency, endurance, and a carefully cultivated detachment. She was polite without being fake, quick without being reckless, and emotionally invisible to the entitled and rude. Her shift partner, Lily Barron, a high school senior with doe eyes and a tremble in her hands, was already 2 orders behind and visibly unraveling at the drink station. Tasha leaned close to her and whispered, "You got this, girl. Don't let them see you sweat." Lily gave a grateful nod, trying not to cry into the whipped cream canister. Behind the counter, arms folded like a sentry guarding his own ego, stood Clayton Renshaw. The manager's shirt was crisp, his hair gelled back like an 80s game show host, and his expression eternally set to disapproving. Clayton wasn't loud. He didn't have to be. He had perfected a tone that managed to be slow, smug, and condescending all at once, the kind that told you any kindness from him was temporary, that your existence here was conditional, transactional, and replaceable. "Melrose," he barked over the sizzle of the fryer, his voice cutting through the din like a razor, "Table 12 is still waiting on their check." "I sent it 10 minutes ago," Tasha replied without looking at him, carefully balancing a tray of waters for booth 7. "Then walk it over yourself next time," he snapped. "Don't just send things." Tasha bit the inside of her cheek. She had learned long ago not to push back. Clayton didn't like being contradicted, and retaliation usually came in the form of bad shifts, short breaks, or being left off the next week's schedule. It wasn't worth it. Not now. Not with rent due. She set down the tray at booth 7 with a tight smile and turned toward the kitchen when she noticed him, an old man standing near the door. He was thin, almost frail, with clothes that clung to his damp frame and worn through elbows that had seen better decades. His hair, a wiry tangle of white, was matted down by the rain. One of his boots was untied. He stood awkwardly, like someone who had walked into the wrong place or forgotten why he was there. Everyone else was too busy arguing over receipts, scrolling through their phones, or drowning in small talk to notice him. Clayton hadn't even looked up. Tasha paused, order slip still in hand, and stepped toward him. "Sir?" she asked gently. "Are you okay?" He blinked slowly, the kind of blink that suggested he'd been somewhere far away in his mind and had just been pulled back. His cloudy eyes searched past her, then finally settled. I think I was supposed to meet someone here," he said, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Around his neck, hidden just under the flap of his damp coat, Tasha caught a glimpse of something metallic. A dog tag. And sewn onto the faded jacket was an old, almost indistinguishable military patch. Korean War. Vietnam. It was hard to tell. He looked like a man who'd been forgotten, and even worse, who had gotten used to it. "You hungry?" she asked. He gave a soft smile, or the beginning of one. I could eat something warm. There was a sign in the break room that Clayton had posted months ago in bold red letters, "We're a business, not a shelter. No handouts." But looking into the man's face, Tasha didn't care. She guided him to the only empty booth, helped him slide into the seat, and grabbed a blanket from the lost and found bin behind the hostess station. Then she walked into the kitchen, slid a $10 bill from her tips into the register, and called out. "Louise, can I get a plate? Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. Extra gravy. Add some cornbread too." Louise, the cook, raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He'd worked with Tasha long enough to know that when she did something out of line, it was for a reason. She brought the plate over herself, along with a glass of warm water. The old man looked at the food like it was something sacred. "Thank you," he whispered. "You didn't have to." "Yeah," Tasha said softly. "I did." But she didn't see Clayton watching from the far end of the counter, arms still folded, expression darkening with each passing second. What she also didn't see, what no one saw yet, was that this simple act of kindness had just lit the fuse on something much bigger than her $10 tip, or one warm meal. Something that would soon shake the cafe to its core and remind everyone in that room what dignity really looked like. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The old man sat in the corner booth like a ghost pulled from another decade, his coat still dripping onto the linoleum floor. A faint smell of wet wool and rusted metal clung to him, and he kept his hands folded neatly on the table, as though waiting for someone to tell him it was all right to touch the food. His eyes, pale and fogged like the sky outside, scanned the room with a kind of uncertainty, as if every passing face might be the one he was here to meet. Tasha watched him carefully from behind the counter while pretending to restock the napkin holders. She saw the way his shoulders hunched low, the way he looked at the steaming plate in front of him but didn't move to eat right away. Like he wasn't sure it was really his. Like he was afraid it would vanish. Behind her, Clayton shuffled papers with extra force, the slap of receipts against the countertop deliberate and sharp. He hadn't said a word yet, but the tension was already thick, wrapping itself around Tasha's spine like a wire pulled tight. Lily, still shaken from the earlier rush, kept her eyes on the lemonade machine and her back to the room, but even she could feel it building. Something about that moment, the old man alone at the booth, the smell of meatloaf in the air, and Clayton's simmering disapproval, made everything else seem suddenly irrelevant. The cafe, usually a cacophony of plates and chatter, seemed to slow around that booth. Tasha tried to keep moving. She delivered drinks, cleared a table, boxed a leftover tuna melt, but her eyes always drifted back to the old man. Finally, after a long moment, he picked up his fork. His hand trembled slightly, but he steadied it against the edge of the plate and scooped up a bite of mashed potatoes. He brought it to his lips slowly, carefully, like it was the first real food he'd tasted in days. Maybe it was. He chewed with deliberate slowness, not from frailty, but as if every bite mattered. As if he needed time to remember the taste of warmth. Tasha approached with the refill pitcher in hand. She wasn't sure why, only that something in her pushed her feet toward his booth before she even thought about it. The glass was still nearly full, but she poured more water anyway. "You okay?" she asked softly. He looked up, startled but not frightened. His voice came out a little clearer this time. "It's been a while since someone asked me that and meant it." Tasha smiled, though her chest tightened. "You're not waiting for someone, are you? You mentioned that earlier." He stared at the window. Rain traced slow rivers down the glass. "I was. Maybe I still am. Or maybe I forgot who I was waiting for." She didn't know what to say to that. She just stood there, awkwardly holding the pitcher until he reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened it slowly, like it might fall apart. Inside was a creased photograph of a young man in a Marine uniform, arms around two other soldiers, all grinning like they were immortal. That one's me, he said, tapping the middle figure with a shaky finger. Ki-san. 1968. We thought we'd live forever. Tasha nodded, letting him share even if she didn't fully grasp the weight of his words. He tucked the photo away gently and sat back. His coat shifted, revealing the faint glint of the dog tag she'd spotted earlier. It swung slightly, catching the overhead light just long enough to reflect against the shiny edge of the plate. She didn't press him for more. She didn't need to. The food was enough. The warmth, the water, the fact that someone had stopped to ask if he was okay, that was the story. That was everything. She gave his shoulder a small pat and turned to check on another table. That's when she saw Clayton. He was leaning against the far end of the counter, arms still crossed, lips pressed so tight they were nearly invisible. His eyes locked onto hers, and even across the room, the message was clear. She froze, heart sinking into her stomach. The pitcher grew heavier in her hand. Clayton pushed off the counter and started walking toward her with the kind of controlled pace that made every step feel like a countdown. She forced herself to breathe, to stay calm, to remind herself that she had done the right thing. He stopped just short of the old man's booth and turned to face her, voice cutting through the hum of conversation like a scalpel. You mind telling me what the hell that was? Nearby customers quieted. The stroller at booth 4 stopped rolling. Someone at the bar paused mid-sip. Tasha straightened, setting the pitcher down slowly. I paid for it, she said, her voice steady. From my own tips. He didn't ask. He looked hungry. Clayton scoffed, his laugh sharp and hollow. That's not how we run things here. You want to play Mother Teresa, do it on your own time. I did. That was my money. He leaned in, lowering his voice but not his anger. You don't decide who gets fed and who doesn't. That's not your job. No, she said, eyes narrowing slightly. But being human is. The silence that followed was not complete, but it was heavy. The kind that fell when people sensed something bigger was unfolding. The old man looked up, confused and trying to follow. Clayton stepped back, raised his voice, and addressed the entire room. Attention, everyone. Just so we're clear, this employee decided to hand out free meals today. So if anyone else wants a handout, Tasha here will gladly foot the bill. Utensils froze midair. The man at booth 7 pulled out an earbud. Someone near the window shifted in their seat uncomfortably. Tasha's face flushed, but she didn't cry. Not in front of him. Not in front of this room full of strangers. Clayton wasn't finished. You're done, Melrose. Turn in your apron and get out. She didn't move. She couldn't. It was as if her limbs had forgotten how. The old man slowly pushed back from the booth. He stood shakily, placing both hands on the table for balance. She didn't do anything wrong, he said. She was kind. Clayton waved him off. Sir, eat your food and stay out of staff business. But the old man didn't sit. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled something small and shimmering. A medal. Bent at the edge but unmistakable. A purple heart. I served in Ki-san, he said, voice clearer now. Most of my unit didn't come back. The men I served with. They'd never let this stand. Tasha stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on his arm. Please, sir. You don't have to say anything. He looked at her, and something in his gaze sharpened. They'll know I'm not alone. Tasha didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. But as she untied her apron and folded it in her hands, she felt something shift in the air. She wasn't just leaving a job behind. She was walking away from a place where kindness had been treated like a crime. And somewhere, in the silence that followed her out the door, something had been set in motion. Something that no one, not even Clayton, could stop. The rain outside showed no signs of letting up. It clung to the windows of Riverside Cafe in streaks, muffling the sounds of traffic and turning the town into a watercolor blur. Inside, the silence after Tasha's dismissal hung heavier than the moisture in the air. Clayton returned to his place behind the counter, lips pressed in a hard line, acting as if nothing had happened. But everything had. Tasha's departure didn't echo like a dramatic exit from a movie. There was no slamming door, no tearful outburst. Instead, it was quiet, dignified, and strangely final. She had left the same way she had always moved, softly, without asking for attention, and yet somehow drawing all of it in her absence. Back at booth 6, the old man, Walter, though no one knew his name yet, sat still, the Purple Heart medal resting on the table beside his half-eaten meal. His fingers twitched near the fork but didn't pick it up again. He kept glancing at the front door, then at the faces around him, uncertain whether to stay or follow. His shoulders sagged lower now, as if the warmth from the food had retreated the moment Tasha did. He had been alone when he entered the cafe, but now he was something else entirely, visible. In the kitchen, Louise turned down the burner on the fryer and wiped his hands on his apron. He looked out through the pass window, where the servers usually picked up plates, but no one was there. The line had slowed. The buzz of the cafe had dulled into a scattered murmur. Lily was still at the drink station, her hands trembling slightly as she poured orange juice into a cracked plastic cup. She hadn't moved since the confrontation. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Clayton, sensing the awkwardness, clapped his hands twice, sharply. "Let's go, people. We've still got orders. We're not closing down just because one waitress can't follow simple rules." No one responded. Louise turned away. Lily blinked down at the orange juice like she'd forgotten what it was for. The customers, too, had become oddly quiet. Some pushed food around their plates. A few exchanged glances. A woman near the window pulled out her phone, propped it against her coffee cup, and began filming, pretending to text while recording the aftermath. Clayton didn't notice her. He was too busy straightening salt shakers, his irritation crackling just under the surface. The way Tasha had walked out without begging or apologizing, without even looking back, it had unsettled him. He was used to people flinching under pressure. He counted on it. He liked things orderly and predictable. But Tasha's calm defiance had thrown something off balance, something he couldn't quite name. Walter, still seated, finally picked up his fork again, but it trembled too much. He set it back down, stared at the plate, and let out a breath that sounded more like a sigh for decades lost than for any one moment. Then, without a word, he leaned down, reached into his coat, and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. It looked like an old letter, or maybe a map, yellowed at the edges. He unfolded it slowly, and on the back was a small, faded number, a phone number. He traced it with one finger and then, with deliberate care, placed it on the table beside the medal. Across the cafe, Lily finally turned around. She glanced toward the table, then at Clayton, then back at Louise. No one said a word. The tension, now less like a string and more like a stretched steel cable, continued to hum beneath everything. Lily stepped out from behind the drink station, holding the cup of orange juice like a peace offering she wasn't sure how to deliver. "Should I take his plate?" she asked, her voice thin. Clayton waved his hand dismissively. "If he's done. Or dump it." "He's not done," Lily said quietly. Clayton glared. "Then focus on the customers who are." At that moment, Walter stood again, slower this time. He picked up the Purple Heart and held it for a second. Then, almost reverently, he placed it back on the napkin and gently folded his hands behind his back. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The act itself, leaving behind something so sacred, was louder than any speech. Near the kitchen, Louise stepped out. "This isn't right," he muttered, wiping his hands. Clayton turned on him. "You want to go too?" Louise didn't flinch. He looked out at the cafe, the half-empty plates, the customers whispering, the girl with the phone recording. "Just saying," he replied. Clayton paced behind the counter like a man trying to find footing on a floor that kept shifting. The room wasn't his anymore, and he knew it. The control he wore like armor had cracked, and people were watching, really watching. Not just what he would do next, but how he would try to salvage the moment. Then the bell over the door jingled. It was a small, familiar sound, but it startled the room more than a gunshot would have. Heads turned. Even Clayton froze. No one walked in right away. Just the sound. A moment later, the door opened again. This time, 4 sets of footsteps echoed against the floor. Heavy. Deliberate. Clean boots. Crisp pants. No hesitation. The 4 men who entered weren't young. They weren't wide-eyed recruits fresh out of boot camp. These were men who had been through things, and the way they walked, calm, composed, like they didn't need permission to command a room, made it clear they weren't here for coffee. The one in front had sergeant stripes and an expression that didn't ask questions, it expected answers. His name tag read Cole. The others followed, forming a silent formation as they surveyed the cafe. Clayton, who had begun to step forward, suddenly paused mid-stride. Walter looked up, blinking. Then something in his eyes shifted, clarity, recognition, maybe disbelief. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he said, almost apologetically. Sergeant Cole nodded once. "We heard. We came to make sure it doesn't go unanswered." The cafe fell completely silent. Tasha, now seated alone at the bus stop across the street, still holding her apron like a relic, didn't know any of this was happening. Not yet. But across that short stretch of wet asphalt, the first tremor of a much larger reckoning had just entered the building, wearing polished boots and the weight of a brotherhood that didn't forget. Clayton stood paralyzed behind the counter as the 4 Marines entered, their boots thudding softly against the linoleum with the kind of weight that silenced rooms. The sergeant in front, Cole, moved with unshakable confidence, scanning every corner of the cafe like he had seen it all before and expected better from the world than what he'd just walked into. The other 3 flanked him, tall, quiet, and composed, each of them radiating a presence that couldn't be ignored. Even the friars seemed to quiet beneath the pressure. Clayton swallowed and forced his feet to move, putting on a smile that didn't reach his eyes as he stepped toward the group. "Gentlemen," he began, lifting his hands like he was greeting customers and not men trained to walk into war zones, "how can I help you?" Sergeant Cole's gaze landed on him, steady and unflinching. "We're looking for the person in charge." Clayton nodded quickly. "That would be me. Clayton Renshaw. Manager here at Riverside Cafe." He extended his hand. None of the Marines took it. Cole looked past Clayton, toward the booth where Walter still sat, now watching the exchange with a quiet intensity that suggested he'd been waiting for something like this. The Purple Heart still sat on the table in front of him, untouched. Cole's jaw tightened slightly. Then he turned back to Clayton. "We understand an employee was fired today for showing basic human decency." Clayton's smile twitched. "Now hold on, there's been a bit of a misunderstanding. She, broke protocol. She gave out a free meal. We have policies here, and she violated them." The second Marine, taller than Cole, stepped forward. His eyes were steel gray and unreadable. "That man in the booth is Walter Haggerty. He served with our unit's grandfather in Vietnam. He's a hero. He's family. She didn't violate protocol, she honored him when no one else would." "I didn't know who he was," Clayton replied defensively. "To me, he was just some random guy looking for a handout. That's not how we run a business." The third Marine, broader and darker skinned, cut in with a voice as calm as it was damning. "A business? You think this is just about policy? She gave him food. That's not theft. That's compassion." Clayton's voice rose slightly as he tried to reassert control. It's not personal. It's about consistency. If we let one person break the rules, then everyone will. That's how things fall apart. Cole took one step closer, his voice low but piercing. You fired a woman in front of your entire staff and your customers. You humiliated her. Not because she stole. Not because she endangered anyone. But because she showed someone a little dignity. At that moment, a customer at the far booth stood up. He was an older man, gray hair under a faded baseball cap, and he cleared his throat. That waitress, he said, voice shaking slightly, she's been working here for years. Always kind. She remembers how I like my coffee. She remembers my name. More than I can say for the guy behind the counter. The words hung in the air. Clayton's face turned a shade redder. Sir, with all due respect. She's the reason I come here, interrupted a young man in a hoodie near the window. Not the food. Not the ambience. Her. Clayton's eyes darted from one voice to the next as the tide began to turn. Lily, who had been frozen in place since Tasha's firing, stepped forward from the drink station. Her voice was soft but firm. She helps me close when I'm falling behind. She walks me to my car when it's dark. She's the reason I didn't quit after my first week. Behind the pass window, Louise's head appeared. His apron was off, slung over his shoulder. You want me to go too? He asked quietly. Clayton's expression cracked. His lips parted but no words came out. We're not here to gang up on anyone, said Cole, stepping between Clayton and the room. We're here to speak up. Big difference. Silence fell again, but it wasn't the silence of confusion, it was the silence that comes before something breaks. And break it did. The tension in the cafe had reached a tipping point, and Clayton realized it just as Louise stepped fully out of the kitchen and dropped his apron on the counter. I'm going to take my break, he said. Might be a long one. Walter rose from his booth, slow and careful, and placed the Purple Heart gently back on the napkin. He didn't look at Clayton. He looked at Cole, then at Lily, then at the empty space where Tasha had once stood. Tell her thank you, he said, barely louder than a whisper. Tell her my boys never forget. He followed the Marines out, his back straighter than it had been when he arrived, his steps more certain. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and the room seemed to release a collective breath. Clayton remained at the center, a man standing in the ruins of his own authority, surrounded by people who had just decided they didn't fear him anymore. It wasn't the yelling that broke him. It wasn't the loss of staff. It wasn't even the whispers of customers slipping out without paying. It was the fact that no one, was defending him. Not one. He turned, mouth open as if to say something, but nothing came out. There was nothing left to say. The Purple Heart remained behind on the table, shining softly under the dull cafe lights, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been revealed. Outside, the rain kept falling. At the bus stop across the street, Tasha sat quietly, her apron folded in her lap. She hadn't seen the Marines. She hadn't seen the shift. But something inside her stirred. Something told her the storm inside that cafe was no longer hers to carry alone. Something had begun. And it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The raindrops thudded gently on the roof of the bus stop shelter, a steady percussion that filled the silence surrounding Tasha as she sat with her apron cradled in her lap. Her fingers gripped the fabric as though it still meant something, though she no longer worked at Riverside Cafe. It wasn't the job she missed or even the pay, it was the feeling of being part of something, the chance to offer small comforts to people in the middle of their messy lives. She hadn't done anything remarkable, at least not in her mind. She saw a man who looked hungry and gave him a plate of food. But Clayton had treated that simple gesture like it was mutiny. Now she sat on the edge of the sidewalk, unsure of whether she had just lost a job or gained something far more powerful. What stung wasn't the firing. It was the humiliation. It was the way Clayton had looked at her, like she was a problem to be discarded. And even worse was the silence of everyone else, her co-workers who had stood by and said nothing as she was dressed down in front of a room full of strangers. Across the street, inside the cafe, Walter Haggerty sat motionless. The food in front of him had grown cold, and the napkin beneath the Purple Heart medal had begun to wrinkle at the edges from condensation on the plate. He hadn't touched either. His hands were flat on the table now, the skin papery and lined with the maps of old battles and time-worn sorrow. His eyes flicked to the door where the 4 Marines had just exited, then slowly turned toward Clayton, who was still trying to reorganize the chaos into something resembling control. But there was no control to be had anymore. The room had shifted. The weight of the moment hung too heavy to be ignored. Walter pushed himself up from the booth. The motion was slow and deliberate, every joint resisting with the kind of protest only age and war can instill. The cafe quieted again, instinctively. The clink of a fork, the sizzle from the kitchen, the shuffle of feet. Everything paused as the old man took a single step forward and looked toward Clayton. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried like a bell rung in a still chapel. "She didn't do anything wrong." Clayton blinked, caught off guard that the man would even speak. I didn't mean to cause trouble," Walter continued, his hand lightly trembling as he gestured toward the plate. "She just asked me if I was hungry. That's all. She didn't ask about money. She didn't ask if I was worthy. She just saw me." Clayton's expression hardened. "Sir, I told you before, this is a staff issue." Walter reached into his coat again, the same motion that earlier had revealed the medal. But this time, he pulled out a small, yellowed paper, creases so sharp it looked like it had lived in that pocket for decades. He unfolded it with reverence and placed it on the table beside the Purple Heart. It was a photograph. 3 young men in uniform, standing in front of a war-torn outpost, arms over each other's shoulders. One of them was Walter, smiling with the certainty of youth and invincibility. The others were gone, he knew it, even if he didn't say it aloud. "She gave me more respect today than I've had in years," he said, his voice clearer now, resonating with something that felt sacred. "She didn't know my name. She didn't know my story. But she knew I mattered. That's more than most folks remember these days." A few heads in the cafe lowered. A woman near the door sniffled quietly. Lily, standing at the drink station, wiped a tear from her cheek and stepped toward the front of the cafe but stopped short of speaking. Walter looked down at the medal one last time, then turned his eyes to the front door. His hand hovered over the Purple Heart, but he didn't pick it up. He placed it back down and spoke to it, or perhaps to someone long gone. "They'll know I'm not alone." Clayton shook his head. "What does that even mean?" But Walter didn't respond. He turned, slow and steady, and made his way toward the exit. Each step was heavy, yet sure. As he passed the other tables, some customers nodded at him. One man stood briefly and placed a hand over his heart. Another whispered, "Thank you for your service." Walter didn't acknowledge any of them directly, but his presence said more than his words ever could. Outside, the rain had not let up. The sidewalk glistened under the dim overcast sky. Walter stepped into it without an umbrella, coat buttoned tightly, head held high. He didn't look left or right. He didn't stop. He walked like a man who had already made peace with whatever storm awaited him next. Inside, the silence finally broke. Clayton slapped the counter, hard, trying to reclaim attention. "Okay, show's over," he announced, forcing a brittle grin. "Let's get back to work, people." But no one moved. Lily stared at him. Louise leaned silently in the kitchen window. The woman near the front who had filmed the Marines now shifted her phone, aiming it straight at Clayton again, as if daring him to say anything else. He blustered for a moment, eyes darting, voice faltering, but the room no longer belonged to him. That authority he once held by tone and posture had melted beneath the weight of what had just unfolded. Back across the street, Tasha hadn't yet seen any of it. She was still staring at the wet pavement, watching her reflection blur with each new raindrop. But a shift in the air made her look up. She spotted Walter stepping away from the cafe, his figure cutting a quiet silhouette against the haze. Something in his posture, calm, tall, determined, told her he had done something in there. Maybe not for her, maybe not because of her, but something that mattered. She watched as he disappeared down the sidewalk, metal left behind, but dignity carried with him. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just gripped the apron tighter and whispered to herself, "They'll know I'm not alone." She didn't fully understand what Walter had meant by those words, but soon, she would. Soon, the whole town would. The scent of scorched bacon lingered in the air long after the breakfast rush had ended, mixing with the smell of damp rain from outside and something less tangible but far more pungent, discontent. Clayton paced behind the counter like a man trying to hold a broken machine together with sheer force of will. His shoes clicked sharply against the tile, his clipboard gripped too tightly in one hand, but nothing about him looked in control. From the outside, the cafe may have seemed the same, coffee brewing, orders being called, but within the walls, something had shifted. Clayton could feel it, even if he didn't understand it. He thought firing Tasha would be like swatting a fly. A quick, clean act of authority. But instead, he'd lit a fuse. And the silence that had followed wasn't compliance. It was the stillness before something bigger. Back in the kitchen, Louise stood at the griddle, spatula in hand, flipping hash browns that no one had ordered. His movements were automatic, almost robotic, but his mind was miles away. He had worked in 6 different kitchens over the last 15 years, and none of them had ever felt quite like this. He remembered when Tasha first started, she had helped him clean up grease spills without being asked, brought him coffee during back-to-back double shifts, and never once complained when he was late with an order. She didn't flirt or fake niceness. She was steady. Real. And she had just been humiliated in front of everyone for doing the one thing every decent person should do, care. Louise looked through the pass window at Clayton, who was now berating Lily for dropping a glass earlier. Her hands were shaking again. She wasn't even trying to hide it. Louise could see it all clearly from where he stood, the same way you see the edges of a cliff after watching someone fall. Clayton's control wasn't real. It was fear. And now, people were tired of being afraid. Lily tried to stay composed, but her voice cracked as she stammered out an apology. Clayton waved it off with a disgusted grunt and turned away like he'd swatted a bug. She turned back to the drink station, eyes glassy. Behind her, a couple of customers were quietly packing their food into to-go boxes without asking. They left a 20 on the table and walked out without making eye contact with anyone. Another man sitting near the window folded his newspaper, stood, and followed them out. Clayton didn't seem to notice. But Lily did. And so did Louise. Inside the cooler, Omar, the 17-year-old dishwasher, sat with his earbuds still in. He hadn't come out since the incident. Tasha was the only person who had ever asked him if he had eaten during shift breaks. She had once brought him a sandwich when he hadn't said a word about being hungry. She had noticed without being told. No one else did. Not Clayton. Not even Lily. He had overheard the entire exchange between Tasha and the old man through the service window. He knew she'd paid for the meal with her own tip money. And he'd watched as she got fired like she was disposable, like kindness was a mistake. Outside, the clouds darkened again, and the rain started to pick up. It tapped harder on the windows now, as if echoing the rising pressure inside the cafe. The woman who had been recording earlier hadn't stopped. Her phone was still perched by her coffee, quietly capturing everything. The look on Lily's face, the nervous glances among staff, the empty tables beginning to multiply. She hadn't even taken a bite of her muffin. Her camera was her statement. Clayton turned his attention to the kitchen window. "Louise," he snapped. "Where's that plate for table 5? Louise didn't answer right away. He continued flipping the hash browns that weren't needed. Clayton's voice rose. "Are you deaf, or just slow?" Louise looked up, calm but solid. "I heard you." "Then act like it," Clayton said, stepping toward the window. Louise leaned in, resting both hands on the metal edge of the pass. "You're a real piece of work, you know that." Clayton's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "I said," Louise repeated slowly, "you're a piece of work. You fired the only person in this place who actually gave a damn. And you did it in front of a room full of people like it was some kind of spectacle." Clayton stepped closer, voice low and sharp. "You want to join her? That it?" Louise didn't blink. "You think that scares me? You think after all the garbage we've put up with, the double shifts, the cut hours, the fake praise when it suits you, that I'm afraid of walking?" The window fell silent. Even the fryer oil stopped bubbling for a second. "I'm just saying," Louise continued, "that you've been riding us for years like we should be grateful for your scraps. But the one person who made this place human? You tossed her out like trash. You can't come back from that." Clayton's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He turned away, muttering under his breath, and walked toward the register. Behind him, Louise shut off the burner. The sizzle died. He untied his apron and laid it gently across the prep table. Then, without another word, he walked out of the kitchen and into the dining area, wiped his hands on a towel, and dropped it next to the cash register. "I'm taking my break," he said, eyes never leaving Clayton's. "Might be a long one." Clayton stood frozen. A customer near the back clapped once, slow and deliberate. Another followed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. Clayton turned to glare, but the eyes that met his weren't afraid anymore. They weren't even angry. They were tired. Of the cruelty, of the silence, of pretending things were okay. Lily, her face still pale, looked across the room and caught Louise's gaze. Something in it steadied her. She didn't move, but the fear in her spine loosened slightly. Behind her, Omar finally emerged from the cooler, removing his earbuds. He looked around, saw the tension, saw the apron on the counter, and quietly stepped into the dish pit without being asked. Outside, the rain beat harder against the pavement, and the bus stop across the street remained still. Tasha hadn't moved. She sat with her apron in her lap and the weight of something new settling on her chest, not regret, not sorrow, but the faint sense that her leaving wasn't the end. That maybe, just maybe, she had started something. Something Clayton couldn't erase. Something that was about to grow. The rain had turned steady now, a dull curtain of sound that shrouded the cafe in gray. The bell above the door gave a sharp chime, and though it rang like any other entry, the air inside Riverside Cafe shifted the moment it did. Heads turned not out of curiosity but instinct. For silhouettes appeared in the doorway, broad-shouldered and still, rain glistening off their coats like armor. They didn't move at first. They stood there, filling the frame with something intangible but unmistakable, presence. Then they stepped forward, one after another, with the kind of synchronized motion that spoke of shared history, discipline, and unspoken understanding. The heavy thump of their boots against the tile wasn't loud, but it silenced the entire room. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Even the fryers in the kitchen seemed to pause, as though the hiss of oil knew not to interrupt. The first man through the door wore sergeant stripes on his sleeve. His jaw was squared, his hair regulation short, and his nameplate read Cole. He moved with calm authority, not seeking confrontation but prepared for it. Behind him were three more men, each different in stature and build, but all radiating the same quiet control. They were not young, and their faces were marked with the kind of experiences that aged a man faster than the calendar. One had a scar that curved under his chin, visible even from across the room. Another had a limp so subtle it only showed when he paused too long. The third's gaze swept the cafe slowly, like he was scanning not just for danger but for truth. Clayton, wiping down the already spotless counter with increasing aggression, looked up. He froze. His hand stopped mid-wipe. The rag hung awkwardly in his fingers as he stared at the men entering. He opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it. The sergeant, Cole, looked toward the back of the cafe, toward the booth near the window where the Purple Heart still rested on its napkin like a sacred offering. The food was untouched, cold now. The old photo lay beside it, a silent witness to everything that had unfolded. Cole moved toward the booth and stood before it for several seconds without saying a word. The others followed. They didn't touch the table. They didn't sit. They simply stood in formation around the evidence of what had taken place, their silence louder than any accusation. Then Cole turned to face the room. His voice was calm, firm, and carried a weight far heavier than volume. Who fired the woman who gave him this plate? The question hovered, unanswered. Clayton finally stepped out from behind the counter. His expression was a mix of false charm and discomfort. I'm not sure what this is about, but... You know exactly what this is about, Cole said, cutting him off with a single glance. The Marine with the scar stepped forward. That man, Walter Haggerty, served with our unit's grandfather. He's the reason some of us joined. He's the reason some of us are still alive. Clayton took a breath and straightened his spine, as though he could find courage in posture. He came in off the street. He wasn't a paying customer. My employee gave away a free meal without permission. That's not how we run a business. The tallest of the Marines, a black man with steady eyes and a voice like granite, folded his arms. And you humiliated her. In front of customers. In front of him. For an act of kindness. She broke policy, Clayton insisted, his voice rising slightly. It's not personal. It looked personal, the Marine replied evenly. It looked like you were reminding her that your rules mattered more than her humanity. Someone near the front cleared their throat. An older woman in a cardigan slowly stood up. Her name was Jean Harlow, a retired nurse who had come to Riverside Cafe every Thursday after her physical therapy appointments. She used a cane, but today she leaned into it with purpose. I was in nursing school during the Gulf War, she said clearly. My brother came home in a box draped in a flag. That man sitting there. He could have been him. That waitress, she treated him with more respect than I've seen in this place in years. Clayton blinked. Ma'am, I don't mean any disrespect. But you did, she cut in. And now everyone's seen it. One by one, other voices followed. Reggie Mathers, a quiet Uber driver who sat in the corner most mornings with his newspaper, stood and pointed at the booth. Tasha's the reason I come here. Not the coffee. She remembers my name. She remembers how I like my toast. You walk past me like I'm part of the furniture. A teenage boy in a hoodie added, she's the only one who gave me a real smile when I came in. Lily stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. She walks me to my car when it's dark. She covers my tables when I'm overwhelmed. When I was broke, she bought me lunch. And never once told anyone. Clayton's face began to shift. Not in anger this time, but in fear. He looked around and saw a room of familiar faces turned unfamiliar. The customers weren't just patrons anymore. They were witnesses. Testimonies. The Marines hadn't come to shout. They hadn't come to threaten. They had come to stand. And they weren't alone. Omar slowly stepped from the dish pit, his apron stained and hands damp. He said nothing, but he stood beside Lily, quiet and unflinching. Even Louise emerged from the back, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe. Clayton's voice cracked slightly. You all want to turn this into a mutiny? This isn't a mutiny, Cole replied, stepping forward. This is accountability. The cafe fell into an almost sacred hush. Outside, the rain continued, but no one heard it. Inside, the truth had settled like dust over everything, visible now in every corner, every face. The Purple Heart still sat untouched on the table, gleaming beneath the dull lights. A symbol not just of sacrifice, but of what had been forgotten, and what had just been remembered. And though Tasha wasn't there to see it, her actions had summoned something ancient and powerful. Respect. Brotherhood. Decency. Sergeant Cole turned back to Clayton one last time. You fired the wrong one. And you're going to feel that for a long time. Then he turned and walked out, boots steady, the others following behind. No one stopped them. No one looked away. And when the bell above the door rang again, it sounded different. Like a verdict. Like the end of an era. The bell above the cafe door clicked shut behind the last of the 4 Marines, but the weight they left behind still pressed against the walls. A stillness lingered, the kind that wasn't empty but full, charged with tension, reflection, and something deeper no one could yet name. Clayton stood stiff behind the register, lips parted, eyes scanning a room that had suddenly turned foreign. The counter he'd leaned on for years felt miles away. The apron he once wore like a badge of command now felt like a noose. Lily stood near the drink station, her apron clutched in one hand, heart pounding in her throat. For the first time since starting the job, she wasn't afraid of him. Her fear had been replaced by a slow, growing certainty that what she and everyone else had witnessed wasn't just wrong, it was a line crossed. She looked to the booth where the Purple Heart still rested on the napkin and knew something bigger than all of them had been set in motion. Clayton tried to recover. His voice reached for authority but landed somewhere closer to desperation. "All right," he called out, forcing a brittle smile, "that was a dramatic little visit. But let's be real, folks, we're still a business. Let's get back to your meals. Show's over." No one moved. The woman with the phone, still recording from her table, angled her camera upward. A quiet defiance shimmered in her gaze. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The footage spoke louder than any accusation. Clayton's smile faltered. He adjusted his collar as if that might help him regain some sense of order. It didn't. Then Jean Harlow, the nurse with the cane, took another step forward. Her gaze locked on Clayton, eyes steady as stone. "Show's not over," she said. "It just started." Clayton's nostrils flared. "This isn't a courtroom. I don't need to stand trial in my own restaurant." "You made it a courtroom," she said. "You dragged a woman's dignity out in front of strangers and kicked it like garbage. You turned compassion into a crime. And now people are speaking up because you finally gave them something they can't ignore." The next voice came from Omar. He didn't raise it, but it carried with quiet strength. "She gave me a ride home when my mom's car broke down. She didn't even ask if I needed one. She just saw I was cold and offered. That was her." Clayton snapped, "She gave away food. Food I pay for. And how much did it cost you?" Jean asked, stepping closer to the counter. $10. 12. "And what's the price of what you've lost?" Clayton's jaw worked but made no sound. His eyes darted to the woman with the phone, then to the others now standing beside their booths, arms crossed, silent but solid. They weren't making a scene. They were simply holding their ground. The weight of what they believed was reflected in their stillness. Louise walked forward, drying his hands with a clean towel, apron gone. He glanced once at the plate still sitting untouched, then at Clayton. "You never asked what we thought of her. You just assumed you were the smartest man in the room. But the only one who kept this place running, quietly and without needing credit, was her." Clayton's voice finally found its edge again, bitter and defensive. "I built this cafe from the ground up. I put in the hours. I made the rules. And you forgot who helped you keep it standing, Louise replied. We weren't just hands on a grill or names on a schedule. We were people. And she was the best of us. Another voice rose from the corner table, Lenny Duval, a trucker with a gravel-rough voice and no patience for drama. He pulled out his wallet, walked to the counter, and placed a 20 beside the register. For the vet's lunch, he said, locking eyes with Clayton. And for the waitress who should still be here. One by one, other customers followed. No shouting. No protest signs. Just quiet, deliberate gestures. A man in a suit laid down a 10. A woman in a hoodie placed a folded 5 on the table where Tasha once stood. A mother with 2 toddlers packed up her food, paused at the exit, and said, "She remembered my kids' names. Every time. You don't fire people like that. You learn from them." Clayton's posture began to cave. The room, once his to command, had turned on him. Not with pitchforks but with memories, truth, and an avalanche of quiet rebellion. He slammed a palm on the counter, trying to force control back into the air. This is ridiculous. You people think you're saints now? Think you know better than the man who pays the bills? Lily's voice cracked as she stepped forward. No. We're just tired of being scared. Tired of pretending kindness is weakness. Clayton shook his head, stepping back from the register as if the whole place were foreign. You don't get to run this cafe. You already lost it, someone muttered from the back. Louise placed his towel down, took off his hat, and said with finality, "I'm done. I'm not going to be the cook who stands by while decency gets punished." Clayton looked around for allies, for someone, anyone, to defend him. But even the dishwasher Omar, young and quiet, stood firm. The room no longer recognized his authority. They recognized the absence of someone who had earned their respect. In the corner, the camera kept rolling. Someone whispered, "It's already online." Clayton's face drained of color. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, as if the storm itself had sensed it was no longer needed. Across the street, Tasha remained seated at the bus stop, unaware of the fire she'd left behind. She held her apron close to her chest, but her mind was already letting go of what it had once symbolized. She wasn't broken. She wasn't ashamed. She had done what was right, even if it had cost her everything. Inside the cafe, a new order had begun to form, not of menus or tips or shift schedules, but of voices that had found their strength. And it had all started with a single plate of meatloaf, paid for in quiet sacrifice and served without permission. And now, there was no going back. The hum of the cafe, once as predictable as sunrise, had fallen into a rhythmless murmur. The clinks of silverware, the soft whoosh of the espresso machine, the distant chatter, none of it held the same meaning anymore. It was as if the entire space had been scrubbed raw, its polished surfaces now mirrors for people's reflections, for their guilt, for their sudden awareness of how fragile dignity could be. Clayton stood near the register like a man who had walked into his own house and discovered it belonged to someone else. He tried to hold his frame tall, shoulders squared, but the corners of his eyes twitched and his hands fidgeted in a way he couldn't quite hide. The control he had once wielded so naturally now slipped through his fingers like steam from a coffee cup. Outside, the rain had softened to a steady mist. The streets of Eugene glistened, reflective like glass, catching the lights of passing cars and the faded glow of the cafe's neon "open" sign. Tasha remained seated at the bus stop across the street, unaware that the place she had walked out of just an hour ago was unraveling like a threadbare apron. She clutched the fabric in her lap like it was a lifeline, but her mind was somewhere else, on the old man's eyes, on his tremble, on the silence that had filled the room after she'd been dismissed. She didn't know it yet, but a ripple had started in that silence, and it was already reaching places far beyond the cracked tiles and steaming coffee mugs of Riverside Cafe. Inside, Lily's phone buzzed. She checked it instinctively, hands still shaking, and blinked at the screen. A message from her cousin read, "Is this your cafe? Saw the video. It's blowing up. Lily's heart skipped. She looked at the woman near the window, the one who had filmed the confrontation. Her phone was still recording, screen angled low, her face unreadable but determined. Another notification lit up Lily's phone. Then another. The video had already made it to a local Facebook group. Within minutes, it had been shared dozens of times. In an hour, it would reach thousands. Reggie Mathers, still seated with his cold cup of coffee, looked up from his own buzzing phone. "Well," he said, voice quiet but resolute, "people are talking." He turned the screen for those around him to see. A still image of Sergeant Cole standing in front of the Purple Heart, Clayton's face in the background, frozen mid-sentence. Beneath it, the caption read, "Veteran humiliated. Waitress fired. Heroes respond." Clayton's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came out. His gaze fell to the Purple Heart still resting on the napkin at the corner booth. He had hoped someone would quietly remove it, dispose of the evidence, and allow the cafe to move on. But no one dared touch it. That medal had become more than a military decoration. It was now a symbol of everything they had tried to forget but couldn't ignore anymore: sacrifice, neglect, dignity, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to let a hungry man go unnoticed. Omar stood behind the dish pit, towel in hand, watching everything unfold. He wasn't filming. He wasn't speaking. But he was remembering. The way Tasha had handed him a sandwich on a day he hadn't eaten. The way she had taken $10 from her own tips and slid it into the register without asking for thanks. The way she had walked out without shouting, without tears, just a folded apron and a quiet spine made of steel. He looked toward the door. He wanted to run after her. To tell her that the story hadn't ended. That it was only beginning. Jean Harlow had pulled out her flip phone, her old hands trembling as she typed a message to her son. "You won't believe what happened at Riverside," she wrote. "It's on video. People are standing up." Then she pressed send and looked back toward Clayton. Her eyes weren't angry. They were disappointed. And that, somehow, was worse. Clayton turned to Louise, who was leaning against the back wall, arms crossed. "You're not helping," he snapped. Louise didn't move. "Neither are you." A couple near the front stood, grabbed their takeout bags, and walked out without a word. They left 2 20s on the table and paused by the door. The man looked back once. "You know," he said, "this place used to feel warm. Now it just feels afraid." The woman with the phone finally ended her recording. She stood up, slid her phone into her jacket, and walked out the door without touching her untouched muffin. No one stopped her. No one asked what she would do with the footage. They already knew. At the bus stop, Tasha's phone buzzed. She ignored it at first, not ready for the world's opinions, not prepared for whatever condolences or criticisms might come. But then it buzzed again. And again. She slowly unlocked the screen. Dozens of unread messages poured in. From Lily. From old friends she hadn't heard from in years. From people she didn't even know. Screenshots of the video. Links to Facebook posts. Texts like, "You're a hero," and "We're with you," and "The whole town's watching." She stared at the screen in disbelief. Then she saw a photo. A frame frozen from the video, a shot of her handing the plate to Walter. He was smiling, she was bent slightly forward, and the plate between them shimmered like something sacred. It wasn't staged. It wasn't posed. But it told the whole story. Inside the cafe, Clayton was beginning to sweat. He pulled out his phone, opened the cafe's official page, and started typing a post. His fingers hovered over the screen. He tried to compose something apologetic but not weak, something vague enough to avoid blame but strong enough to sound sincere. Every sentence he wrote felt hollow. Finally, he typed, We regret any misunderstandings that may have occurred today and are committed to treating all guests and employees with respect moving forward. He stared at it. Then deleted it. Then typed it again. Then hit post. Within seconds, the comments flooded in. You regret getting caught. That woman deserves better. Take responsibility or step down. His hands trembled. He tried to close the app, but more notifications kept appearing. Too fast to silence. Too many to escape. Louise walked past him, reached behind the counter, grabbed his keys, and placed them on the register. You lost more than a good worker today, Clayton, he said. You lost your heart. Then he walked out the door, apron still on, into the mist. And for the first time in years, Clayton was left alone in his cafe, surrounded by people who no longer looked at him like a leader. The Purple Heart still rested on its napkin, untouched. And across the street, Tasha stared at her phone, realization dawning not in triumph, but in quiet awe. The town had found out. And they weren't looking away. The mist clung to the pavement in ghostly wisps as the street lights flickered to life one by one along 4th and Maple. The once bustling Riverside Cafe now looked like a hollowed shell of its former self from across the street where Tasha sat motionless at the bus stop. Her fingers were still curled around her apron, the fabric damp from the moisture in the air, but her grip had loosened. She had been watching the door of the cafe, watching customers walk out one by one, watching as no one else walked in. She had seen Louise leave with his head high and his apron still tied. She had seen the woman with the phone step out with the certainty of someone who knew a truth that would no longer be silenced. And still, she hadn't moved. Something inside her told her the story wasn't finished. Not yet. Her phone was still buzzing in intervals, each new notification tugging at her focus like an urgent whisper. Posts were multiplying. The video had now reached a regional news outlet's page. A friend from Portland had sent her a message, "You're everywhere right now. You okay?" Tasha hadn't responded. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't sure if she was okay. All she knew was that the world around her was suddenly moving without her, and she wasn't sure whether to catch up or stay still. Then she noticed the vehicle. It didn't make any noise when it pulled up, not the usual rumble of a pickup or the whine of a delivery van. It was a black Chevy Suburban, tinted windows, clean exterior, nothing flashy. It rolled to a stop just outside the cafe, idling with a low, steady hum. There were no decals, no government plates, no flags or banners. But something about the way it moved, smooth, precise, deliberate, made her sit up straighter. It didn't belong to a regular customer. This wasn't someone coming in for eggs or hash browns. The vehicle gave off an air of purpose. The driver's door opened first. A man in uniform stepped out. He wasn't young, not fresh from boot camp. His posture was firm but not stiff, like a man who had spent years earning the right to stand easy. He wore sergeant stripes, and his boots were well worn but clean. His name tag read Reuben Cole. Tasha recognized the name from the messages flooding her phone. Sergeant Cole. The one who had confronted Clayton. The one who had stood in front of the Purple Heart and said without flinching, "You fired the wrong one." 3 more doors opened in succession, and 3 more men stepped out. They weren't identical, but they moved like a single unit. One was black, his build stocky and powerful. Another was tall and lean with a faint scar running beneath his jawline. The third had Latino features, a quiet calm in his gaze that suggested he'd seen too much and spoken too little. Their presence on the street seemed to slow time itself. Passers-by on the sidewalk slowed without realizing why. People glanced over, then looked away quickly, sensing something unspoken and important in the air. Tasha stood slowly, unsure why her legs were moving but unable to stay seated. She held her apron tight to her side, heart thudding now in a rhythm that felt strange, half fear, half wonder. She wasn't afraid of them. That wasn't it. But something told her she was about to be pulled into a part of the story she hadn't expected to be part of. She took one hesitant step forward, then stopped. The four men didn't walk toward her. Instead, they headed straight for the door of the cafe. The bell jingled as they entered, the same sound it always made, but somehow, like the rest of the world in that moment, it felt heavier. Inside, Clayton had just posted his apology to the cafe's social media page and was reading the first wave of furious responses when the door opened. He didn't look up right away. He thought it was another customer or maybe a reporter. Then he saw the uniforms. The rag slipped from his hand. His face lost what little color it had regained. He took a step back instinctively. Sergeant Cole led the group to the booth where the Purple Heart still rested. He looked down at the medal, then back at Clayton. "It's still here," he said, voice low and calm. "That's something." Clayton stammered. I didn't know he meant that much to you." "He meant that much to this country," said the Marine with the scar. "And to the woman you fired." "I told you, she broke policy," Clayton said, his voice rising slightly as if repetition would turn his excuse into truth. Cole stepped closer. "And you broke trust. You turned your back on decency in front of everyone. You made kindness into a spectacle. And now the world's watching." Clayton threw up his hands. "What do you want from me?" "I said I regretted the misunderstanding." The Marine with the calm eyes stepped forward. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a moment where you had the chance to choose the right thing and chose yourself instead. You wanted control. You got attention." Another Marine pulled something from his coat pocket, a small photograph. He placed it gently next to the Purple Heart. It showed Walter Haggerty, years younger, smiling with two other Marines, one of whom bore a strong resemblance to the man who had just spoken. "He's family," the Marine said. "He's the reason we're here. He called one of us. Told us someone saw him. Saw him like a human being. Not as a burden. Not as a forgotten relic. But as a man who gave and never asked for anything back." Clayton tried to speak, but Cole silenced him with a glance. "You fired someone for doing what this country was built on. Honor. Compassion. Service without reward. And you're going to learn that what you've lost is bigger than one employee." They turned and began to leave, their presence leaving as sharply as it had arrived. But then the tall Marine paused at the door. He looked back once, eyes narrowing. "You'll remember her name long after people forget yours." And with that, they exited into the mist. Across the street, Tasha stood frozen, her breath caught. She had seen them enter. Now she watched them emerge. She didn't know what had just happened inside, but she didn't need to. The message was written in the silence they carried with them. Sergeant Cole caught her gaze across the road. He nodded once. It was small. But it was enough. Tasha's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from someone she didn't know. "You did more in one moment than most do in a lifetime." She read it, closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, the black Suburban had pulled away, gliding back into the fog like it had only come to deliver a message the town needed to hear. She stood alone at the bus stop, not knowing that this was the moment everything would begin to change. Not just for her, but for everyone who had watched, stayed silent, and now, could no longer pretend not to see. The bell above the cafe door had barely stopped swaying when the silence inside began to thicken again. Clayton stood near the register, his arms crossed but his confidence unraveling strand by strand. His earlier declaration of regret had landed like a stone in a dry well, no echo, no effect. His eyes kept flicking toward the booth where the Purple Heart still rested, beside the photograph now left by one of the Marines. They hadn't taken the medal. They hadn't touched a thing. And in doing so, they had left something behind that Clayton couldn't ignore. A wound. An indictment. A legacy. Across the street, Tasha hadn't moved. She stood under the faded metal canopy of the bus stop, her arms wrapped around her apron like it might shield her from the weight of everything unfolding. The cold no longer bothered her. What pressed down on her chest now was not fear, but the unfamiliar sense of being at the center of something she never intended to start. She had walked away with nothing more than a folded piece of cloth and the quiet satisfaction of doing what felt right. But somehow, the world had decided that this moment mattered. The black Suburban turned the corner and disappeared from view, its presence lingering like the echo of a drumbeat. Tasha watched it go, then turned her eyes back toward the cafe. The windows reflected the cloudy sky, but through the glass, she could see movement. A few customers remained, hunched over coffee they no longer drank, shifting in their seats as though waiting for something else to break. Even now, the atmosphere inside refused to return to normal. A different kind of current had taken hold, restless, alert, like the town itself was holding its breath. Then came the second surprise. A second vehicle pulled up. Not black, not slick like the Suburban. This one was a weathered gray van with military plates and a rusted bumper. The engine rumbled low before cutting off. The doors opened, and this time, what stepped out wasn't just another squad of polished soldiers. These were older men. No matching uniforms. No formation. They moved slower, one using a cane, another with a slight limp that came from years of service, not injury. They weren't here to make a statement. They were here to bear witness. The man who stepped forward first was tall and barrel-chested, his salt and pepper hair tucked under a faded Marine Corps cap. His eyes scanned the cafe with a quiet gravity. Two others followed, a Latino man in a bomber jacket covered in patches, and a black veteran wearing a soft navy windbreaker over a shirt that read "Once a Marine, always a Marine." The fourth, oldest of the group, wore a clean-collared shirt tucked into jeans and carried himself with the kind of calm that came from surviving things no one could explain in words. Tasha didn't recognize them, but she didn't need to. Their presence alone spoke volumes. These weren't active-duty Marines answering a call. These were men who had lived through too much to ignore injustice when it walked through the door. Inside the cafe, Clayton had barely turned around before the bell rang again. The sound made him flinch. He looked up, expecting reporters or another angry customer with a phone. What he saw instead made the words catch in his throat. These men didn't walk in like customers. They walked in like the room already owed them something. And maybe it did. The tall one with the Marine cap walked up to the counter. He didn't raise his voice, didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "We heard about Walter." Then he nodded toward the booth. Clayton glanced at the Purple Heart, then back at the man. He's gone now," he said, uncertain. "But I didn't know who he was." "You didn't need to," the man replied. "That young woman did. That was enough." More customers had turned now, watching, listening, no longer pretending to mind their own business. The energy shifted again, not dramatic, not explosive, but deep, like roots threading through the floor. The man in the bomber jacket stepped forward, his voice worn but steady. "You fired her for giving him a hot meal. Not for theft. Not for disrespect. Just for a plate of food. And now every vet in this town knows it." Clayton's eyes widened. "This is getting out of hand. I've apologized." "You posted a paragraph," the black veteran said. "That's not the same thing." The man with the cane walked to the booth, looked at the Purple Heart, then sat down beside it like he was guarding something sacred. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Just sitting there made the point. This wasn't about publicity. It was about presence. Clayton took a step back. "You want me to hire her back? Is that it?" "No," the man in the Marine cap said. "You want to fix something. You don't start by rehiring her. You start by understanding why she mattered more than your rules." The cafe had filled with silence again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was expectant. One of the remaining customers, a middle-aged woman with glasses and a kind face, rose and stepped forward. "She used to serve my father before he passed," she said. "Every Friday, same booth, same coffee. She'd sit with him when I couldn't make it. He told me she made him feel like he hadn't been forgotten." Clayton's voice was brittle. "I didn't know that." "No," the woman said, "you never asked." Louise had returned from outside, apron untied around his neck. He didn't say a word, just watched. Behind the counter, Lily wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve, then walked to the front of the cafe where the veteran stood. She took a deep breath and said, "You're not alone." She wasn't either. "And neither is Walter." The man with the marine cap nodded. "That's what matters." Outside, more cars were pulling up. Not a parade, not a protest, just people. People who had seen the video, read the posts, or heard the whispers spreading like wildfire through town. Tasha stood beneath the dripping edge of the bus shelter, her phone buzzing once again. This time, the message was short. "Come inside. Something's happening." She hesitated, looking through the window. She saw the old men standing in the place she had once called her workplace. She saw Lily near the front, her shoulders straighter than they'd ever been. She saw the Purple Heart still resting where she'd left the meal. And she saw a town that had stopped pretending not to care. She took a breath. And then she stepped off the curb. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Tasha crossed the street without rushing, her shoes pressing into puddles that mirrored the stormy sky above. She held her apron tight against her side like a piece of herself she hadn't yet decided to put down. The town she had known all her life, with its gentle streets and weathered shops, had shifted beneath her feet. As she approached the cafe door, she could hear the low murmur of voices inside, not angry or chaotic, but solid and unified. She paused just outside, catching her reflection in the glass. Her hair was damp, her clothes were creased from the rain and the weight of what she'd carried all day, but her eyes held something different now. Not fear. Not shame. Just a quiet, steady fire. She pushed the door open. The bell rang, but unlike every other time she had heard it, rushing between booths or ducking past Clayton's glares, it didn't fill her with urgency. It simply announced that she was there. That she had returned. Heads turned slowly, and the room seemed to inhale. Louise, leaning near the kitchen doorway, straightened. Lily, standing beside the group of older veterans, covered her mouth for a moment, eyes wide. One of the Marines turned and gave her a respectful nod. The man with the cane at the booth didn't rise, but his face softened, like he'd been waiting for her all along. Clayton was the last to look up. His eyes registered surprise first, then defensiveness. He stepped out from behind the counter, as if to intercept her, but then hesitated, suddenly unsure whether he had the right to say anything at all. Tasha didn't walk toward him. She walked toward the booth. The Purple Heart was still there, exactly as she had left it, the photograph now beside it, along with a folded napkin. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the metal but not lifting it. It wasn't hers to take. It was a symbol now, of what had happened, of what still mattered, of what people had chosen to see. "I didn't expect all this," she said quietly. "You didn't have to," said the man in the marine cap. "You did something right." The rest followed. She looked over at Lily, who stepped closer, her voice shaking slightly. "I should have said something when it happened. I should have stood up." Tasha reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "You just did." More customers were rising now. Not in protest, not to leave, but in recognition. Some nodded. Some murmured her name. A man near the back who had stayed silent through the entire ordeal finally stepped forward. He was heavy-set, with a grizzled beard and hands that looked like they belonged to someone who fixed machines for a living. "I'm not good with speeches," he said. "But she's the reason I come here before work. She smiles, asks about my wife. Remembers I like 2 sugars, not 3. That may not seem like much, but when your mornings are hard and long, that kind of kindness is gold." A teenager near the window spoke up. "She helped me with my homework once. I was sitting here waiting for my mom, and she just sat down and helped me figure out this math problem like it was nothing." Then came Omar, quiet as ever, stepping into the light near the front. "She's the only one who ever asked if I needed a ride. I didn't even have to say anything. She just saw it." The words came slowly at first, one voice after another, then more, like pieces of a puzzle being laid down in front of Clayton for the first time. Every small act Tasha had done, every unnoticed kindness, every extra effort, began to form a picture he couldn't ignore. He stood near the register, lips pressed tight, eyes scanning the faces of the people he had once thought were his silent allies. But they were no longer silent. Lily stepped beside Tasha. "You didn't just serve food. You made people feel like they mattered." Tasha's throat tightened, but she held her composure. "I didn't do it for recognition." "That's what makes it matter," said Louise, his arms folded across his chest. "You did it anyway." From the corner of the cafe, Cheryl Miles, who ran the hair salon 2 doors down, rose and crossed her arms. "Clayton," she said evenly, "I've seen how you treat your staff. I've heard the tones, read the notes you taped to the back wall. This isn't just about one plate of food. You made this place about fear. And Tasha made it about warmth. Guess which one people remember?" Clayton tried to gather his voice. "I had to enforce standards. You enforced ego," Cheryl cut in. "There's a difference." Then came the final voice, soft but resolute. It was Omar again, standing tall now. "If she's not good enough to work here, I probably never was either." The cafe fell into silence again, but this time it was filled with something sacred. The weight of truth. The cost of silence. The power of a single moment to change everything. Tasha stepped forward, placing her apron gently on the counter. She didn't toss it or hold it up. She simply set it down with the same care she had always brought to every plate, every customer, every shift. Then she turned to the room and spoke with a voice that was calm, firm, and unshakable. "I came back to say thank you. Not just to those who stood up, but to those who are learning how to. This wasn't about me. It was about someone who needed a warm meal and someone else who finally saw him. That's it. That's all it ever was." She turned back to the booth, gave the Purple Heart one last look, then headed for the door. But before she could leave, one by one, customers rose. Not clapping. Not chanting. Just standing. Standing like they had seen something good and wanted to honor it. Tasha didn't cry. She nodded once, her eyes glistening, and stepped back into the mist, her steps slow and certain. Outside, the air was cool and clean. The town hadn't changed. The streets hadn't changed. But the people had. Something had been reclaimed. A reminder that decency, no matter how small, is never wasted. And inside the cafe, the metal still sat at the booth by the window, catching the dim afternoon light like a flame that refused to be extinguished. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time that week, casting streaks of pale gold across the wet sidewalks of Eugene. It was the kind of light that made the town look softer, gentler, as though it too needed a moment to breathe. But inside the Riverside Cafe, the atmosphere remained suspended between reflection and reckoning. Clayton sat in the back office, door ajar, his hands resting on the edge of his desk like they no longer knew what to do. His computer screen still glowed faintly with the social media post he had made hours earlier, a rushed, hollow apology that was now buried under thousands of comments, most of them scathing. Outside the office, the cafe had grown quieter than usual. People still came in, but not for eggs or coffee. They came to see. To bear witness. The Purple Heart was still on the booth table, now surrounded by flowers left by strangers, old photographs of veterans, and handwritten notes taped carefully to the window nearby. Someone had printed out a picture of Walter Haggerty, young, strong, in uniform, and placed it upright behind the medal. No one had touched the meal Tasha had served. It had long gone cold, but it remained untouched, like a sacred offering. Lily moved through the space like someone who had found new footing. She was still soft-spoken, still quick to blush when people looked at her too long, but now she walked with a steadier pace. She refilled coffee without prompting, took orders when they came, and nodded with purpose when customers spoke kindly of Tasha or asked about the old man in the photo. Her eyes lingered at the booth whenever she passed by, and each time, they grew just a little more determined. In the corner, Cheryl Miles from the salon sat with a laptop, answering emails and coordinating a community fundraiser. She had decided that enough was enough, Eugene needed to make something meaningful out of what had happened. A charity drive had begun, titled simply, One Plate of Kindness. The goal was to raise funds for veteran care programs and local shelters. But more than that, it was about giving the town a way to speak back. To show that Tasha's action was not an exception, but a standard worth protecting. Word had spread fast. Local news stations began covering the story in waves. Then the national outlets picked it up. A segment aired on a major cable channel, showing grainy footage of the four Marines walking into the cafe. A commentator, voice calm and serious, spoke over it. One young woman's act of compassion has sparked a national conversation about empathy, dignity, and the power of standing up for what's right. The video clip had already been viewed over 2 million times. At the Veterans Center across town, a volunteer named Joel paused as he watched the news report playing on a mounted screen. He had seen the cafe with his own eyes just 2 days before, had driven past it countless times, never realizing what was boiling beneath its surface. Now he watched footage of Tasha, humble, drenched in rain, standing beside the Purple Heart, and felt something stir in him that had long been buried. He clicked off the TV and stood, mind made up. There were people he needed to call. By the afternoon, Clayton knew the silence wouldn't last. He had avoided going out front. Every time he tried, the looks burned too hot. He was used to being in control, used to calling the shots and having the last word. But now, no one listened. Even Louise had stopped speaking to him directly, simply nodding when necessary and focusing entirely on the customers. Clayton had considered shutting the cafe down for a few days, let things cool off. But he knew it wouldn't help. What had begun wasn't going to die quietly. He finally stood and walked out of the office. The murmur of conversation fell still for a moment as he stepped into the dining area. He scanned the room, expecting a confrontation, but what he found was worse. Indifference. The patrons didn't look at him like they feared him. They didn't look at him like he mattered. They looked at him like he was irrelevant. Like they had already moved on. Then, to his left, he saw Cheryl rise. "Clayton," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" He stiffened. "About what?" "About her," she said simply, pointing toward the door. "About Tasha. About making this right." He tried to swallow the defensiveness rising in his throat. "I issued a statement. I said what I needed to say." A soft scoff came from a young man near the register. "No, you said what you thought would save face." Someone else added, "Actions speak louder." Clayton looked toward the window, where the photograph of Walter now stood beside a candle someone had lit earlier. The sight of it pierced deeper than he expected. He could still hear the old man's voice from that day, could still see the way Tasha had knelt beside him, placing the plate gently before him like it was an offering. In all the years Clayton had run the cafe, he'd never seen anyone look at a customer that way, not as a transaction, but as a person. A soul. He had overlooked that. No, he had buried it. He cleared his throat. I want to speak to her, he said. Cheryl's brows rose. You'll have to find her first. And it's not her who owes you time, it's you who owes her truth. With that, she turned back to her table, leaving him standing in the center of the cafe with no power, no script, and no shield. Just a man slowly realizing that the town he thought he controlled had outgrown him. Outside, just down the block, Tasha sat at a different cafe, sipping lukewarm tea and watching the footage play again on someone else's phone at the next table. She hadn't planned to stay in town. Part of her had thought maybe she'd catch a bus and disappear for a while, let the noise die down. But something in her kept whispering, not yet. There was something still unfinished. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Lily, he wants to talk. But we don't need him to. The town's with you now. Tasha smiled faintly. Not because of the message, but because of the truth it held. For once, she wasn't alone in believing that one act of kindness could matter. That feeding a hungry man could change a town. And maybe, just maybe, a nation watching too closely for what's wrong had finally caught a glimpse of what was right. The newsroom was abuzz with tension, the kind that only came before a live segment that might go viral. At WNEX Channel 7, the anchor Lisa Hart adjusted her earpiece and glanced once more at the notes in front of her. There were stories that were flashy, sensational, and fleeting, and then there were stories like this. Stories that struck a deeper chord, that reached beyond the noise and stirred something human. The segment was scheduled for 10 minutes, but everyone in the control room knew it would go longer. It had to. Tasha Melrose was waiting in the green room, modest in appearance but steady as a mountain in posture. Her hair was pulled back simply, her blouse crisp but inexpensive, and her eyes clear though tired. She hadn't asked for this spotlight, hadn't pursued fame or justice through noise. All she'd done was offer a plate of food to a man who looked like he had been forgotten. And now, somehow, she was at the center of a national conversation. Lisa stepped into the room, extended her hand, and smiled warmly. Miss Melrose, thank you for agreeing to come. Tasha nodded, her handshake firm. I wasn't sure I wanted to. We understand, Lisa said, motioning toward the set. We just want your voice to be heard. You've already inspired a movement. As Tasha walked to the chair beside the anchor desk, she glanced toward the screen behind them, where a still image of Walter Haggerty was frozen mid-smile, seated at the Riverside Cafe booth. He looked proud, peaceful. That image had become iconic, shared across platforms, printed in newspapers, splashed onto posters supporting veteran causes. In some photos, the Purple Heart shimmered under light. In others, it was the expression on Tasha's face that caught people, a mix of concern, respect, and quiet resolve. The director counted them in, and then the red light blinked. Good evening, Lisa began, turning to face the camera. Tonight, we bring you a story that has captured the heart of the nation. You may have seen the now viral video of 4 Marines walking into a small-town diner to stand up for a woman who had just been fired. But what you haven't heard, at least not in her own words, is why she did it. And what happened next? Lisa turned to Tasha. Tasha Melrose, thank you for being here. Tasha nodded again. Thank you for having me. Lisa leaned in slightly, her voice dropping into a gentler cadence. Let's start at the beginning. Tell us about that day. What made you bring that man a meal? Tasha didn't need to search for words. He looked hungry, she said simply. Not just physically. His eyes were hollow. His hands were trembling. He sat down like someone who hadn't been welcomed in a long time. I didn't see a customer or a problem, I saw someone who needed to be reminded he still mattered. Lisa let the silence hang for a beat before asking, did you know he was a veteran? Tasha shook her head. Not at first. But you could feel it. There was this dignity about him. And pain too. Like someone who had lived 1,000 stories he couldn't tell anymore. Lisa nodded, visibly moved. What was going through your mind when you were fired on the spot? I thought, this is the world we live in. Kindness is a risk, Tasha said. But I didn't regret it. Not even for a second. The feed shifted to display clips from the surveillance camera, showing the moment the Marines entered the cafe. The camera caught the way the room had fallen still, the way the men had stood like sentinels around the booth, and the way customers slowly rose in support. It was a cinematic moment that had played on loop across millions of screens. But this time, with Tasha beside the image, it felt different, more real, more raw. Lisa's tone deepened. Were you surprised when the community rallied around you? I was overwhelmed, Tasha admitted. I've lived in Eugene all my life. I thought I knew it. But I didn't know how ready people were to stand for something true. I think everyone's been waiting for a reason to say, enough. Then came the question Lisa had saved for last. If you had the chance to speak directly to the person who fired you, what would you say? Tasha didn't blink. I'd say thank you. Lisa's brow arched, visibly taken aback. Thank you. Yes, Tasha said calmly. Because without that moment, this wouldn't have happened. Sometimes people show us exactly what needs to change. And sometimes, when a door closes, it opens something much bigger than we ever imagined. The control room was silent. The producer mouthed, "We're going long," and gave a thumbs up. Lisa leaned forward again. There's a campaign now, One Plate of Kindness. It's raised over $100,000 for veteran support services. How does that make you feel? Tasha's voice cracked slightly. Like Walter didn't disappear. Like his story is feeding others, literally. That's all I ever wanted. That he'd be remembered. After the broadcast ended, Lisa turned off her mic and reached for Tasha's hand. That was powerful. I didn't come here to be powerful, Tasha said. I came here because I wanted people to understand he wasn't just an old man. He was someone. He served. He sacrificed. And he was starving. Outside the studio, reporters and photographers waited, but Tasha asked to leave quietly. She exited through a side door, breathing in the cool evening air as if it were the first clean breath she'd taken all day. Her phone buzzed again, another text, this time from Cheryl. You did good. The whole cafe watched it live. Even Clayton. She smiled faintly. Somewhere across town, the man who had fired her was sitting in the back booth, staring at the TV in the corner of his cafe, his own reflection shimmering beside Walter's frozen smile. And for the first time, Clayton didn't see Tasha as the girl who had disobeyed him. He saw her as the woman who had changed everything. The morning air was unusually still as Lily unlocked the doors to Riverside Cafe, her keys jangling softly in the silence. The street outside had barely woken, but inside, the cafe was already pulsing with energy, an energy that hadn't existed before Tasha's act of kindness lit a fire beneath the town's conscience. The same booth near the window remained untouched, Walter's purple heart medal glinting beneath the glass someone had placed over it. Around it were notes, drawings, flowers, mementos of gratitude from strangers and neighbors alike. But that morning, something new rested at the center of the table, a plain white envelope with Tasha's name on it. Lily stood frozen for a moment. It hadn't been there when she locked up the night before. She glanced around, wondering if someone had dropped it off early. A wave of hesitation passed through her as she reached for it, then decided against it. Instead, she picked up her phone and texted Tasha, "There's a letter here. It's for you." Tasha read the message while sitting on the small back porch of her apartment, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug. The text sent a ripple through her chest. She hadn't been back to the cafe since the interview. Even with the overwhelming support, she felt the kind of attention she'd never sought weigh heavily on her. But something about the letter made her feel like the time had come. She set the mug down, tied her hair back, and grabbed her jacket. When she walked in, the bell chimed, and a hush fell over the cafe. People turned toward her, not out of curiosity, but with quiet recognition, like someone watching a sunrise. Lily met her near the counter, eyes bright with emotion. She didn't say anything, just handed her the envelope. Tasha took it gently, fingers trembling as she turned it over. There was no return address, no signature, just her name in a shaky but careful scrawl. She walked over to the booth, sat down in front of the metal, and opened it. The letter inside was handwritten on old, yellowing paper. She unfolded it slowly, heart thudding. Dear Tasha. I don't know if you'll remember me for long. Maybe I'm just another face among the hundreds you served. But I remember you. I remember your eyes, not the color, but the way they looked at me. Like I wasn't invisible. Like I hadn't already been buried by the world. My name is Walter Haggerty. I served in the 1st Marine Division during Vietnam. Most of the men I knew back then are gone now. The ones who made it home didn't always bring their minds with them. Some of us walk around like ghosts, waiting to fade all the way out. That's what I was doing the day I walked into your cafe. I hadn't eaten in a full day. I'd walked until my knees ached, until the city lights looked like hallucinations. I didn't want charity. I didn't want pity. I just wanted to be seen one last time before I disappeared. You didn't ask me to prove I was worth it. You didn't measure me. You just fed me. That's something no battlefield ever taught us, that the deepest wounds aren't always the ones with blood. Sometimes, they're the ones that come from being forgotten. I saw the manager yell at you. I saw your coworkers freeze. And I saw you hold your head high when he fired you. That moment broke me, not because of what he did, but because I realized I wasn't the only one this world forgot how to treat right. I didn't have the words to say thank you then. So I'm writing now, in case you wonder if it mattered. It did. That plate of food. It tasted like the first thing I'd earned in decades. But it wasn't about the sandwich. It was the dignity. After I left that day, I didn't disappear. I went to the VA clinic, something I'd been avoiding for years. Told them I needed help. Told them I was tired of pretending I was fine. I don't know where the courage came from. Maybe from you. Maybe from that plate. They got me into a shelter that same night. I'm clean now. I've started writing letters to my daughter again. I don't know if she'll answer. But for the first time in years, I believe she might. I heard you lost your job because of me. I hated that at first. But now I see what came from it. I saw your interview. I saw those Marines. And I saw the world wake up for a moment. Maybe more than a moment. Maybe something new is being born. Please don't let them tell you kindness is weakness. It's the strongest thing we have left. Semper Fi. Walter. Tasha sat in stunned silence as the letter trembled in her hands. The world around her faded, the quiet conversations in the cafe becoming a hum behind the roar in her ears. Walter wasn't gone. He was still out there. Still fighting. Still healing. Because of something she had done without even thinking. Lily sat down across from her, eyes wide. Is it from him? Tasha nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. Yeah. It is. Word spread quickly through the cafe, passed from one whisper to the next, until the whole room seemed to lean in toward her, not out of intrusion, but reverence. Louise appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, and Cheryl walked in from outside just as Lily began reading the letter aloud for those nearby who couldn't see. By the time she reached the final lines, there wasn't a dry eye in the cafe. Tasha folded the letter, pressing it gently to her chest. She didn't say much after that. She didn't need to. The letter had said it all. That day, as the cafe remained open longer than usual, something sacred lingered in the air. It wasn't about the food anymore. It wasn't even about Walter or Tasha. It was about the invisible people being seen again. One act. One moment. And now, one voice, spoken through paper, had circled back to where it began, not to end the story, but to begin another. And Tasha knew, deep in her soul, she would never be the same. The following Monday began like any other in Eugene, with the scent of rain on pavement, the sound of bus brakes hissing, and the faint hum of a town waking up. But there was something different in the air this time. Something brewing beneath the surface. Tasha had planned to stay quiet after receiving Walter's letter, but fate had other plans. A few hours after she left the cafe that day, Cheryl had uploaded a scanned copy of Walter's letter to the One Plate of Kindness website. Within minutes, it had gone viral. Veterans forums, military family pages, and national media picked it up. Within 24 hours, #WalterLives trended across multiple platforms. Suddenly, it wasn't just a local story anymore. It was a national cry for compassion. Outside Riverside Cafe, a line had formed before the sun even came up. Not for pancakes. Not for autographs. People waited with photos in their hands, pictures of their fathers, brothers, daughters, all in uniform. Some brought letters of their own. Some just came to sit in the booth, place a hand over the Purple Heart, and cry silently. The cafe became a place of pilgrimage, a sanctuary where memories and hope converged. Cheryl arrived early and was greeted by the sight of a makeshift altar someone had assembled overnight. Candles, boots, dog tags, and notes scribbled on napkins, all gathered around a framed photo of Walter as a young Marine. She paused, took it in, and smiled through the lump in her throat. Inside, Lily had already started brewing coffee. She moved like she had found her rhythm again, carrying herself not as a waitress, but as a steward of something sacred. When Tasha walked in that morning, the entire room quieted, not in reverence but in warmth. A young girl, no older than 10, approached her with a folded piece of construction paper. Tasha knelt, accepting it gently. Inside was a drawing of an old man and a young woman sitting across a table, a sandwich between them. Above the picture, in bright crayon letters, it said, "This is what heroes do." Later that morning, the mayor of Eugene stopped by unannounced. Dressed in a modest gray suit, he didn't come with cameras or press, just a small team and a quiet resolve. He approached Tasha as she poured coffee for an elderly couple and asked, "May I speak with you a moment?" Tasha obliged, following him to the back of the cafe. He looked around at the photos on the wall, the crowd forming outside, and then met her eyes. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted. "You've turned this cafe into a community heart." "I didn't turn it into anything," Tasha replied. "People just wanted to feel something again." The mayor nodded. "And now they do. Which is why I want to honor that." He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it, revealing a gold pin in the shape of a torch. "This is the Eugene Civil Light Award. We only give it to people who shine in the darkest moments." Tasha stared at it, speechless. "You didn't just feed a man," the mayor continued. "You reminded an entire town of its soul." As he pinned it on her shirt, applause erupted from the dining room. Someone had overheard, and like wildfire, the word spread. People stood, clapped, and some wept. Tasha didn't smile for the praise, she smiled because it wasn't about her anymore. It never had been. It was about what people were becoming because of one moment. That afternoon, the cafe held a small but powerful gathering. Veterans from every decade filled the seats, sharing stories with strangers. A World War II vet told a boy about climbing the cliffs of Normandy. A woman from the Gulf War showed her combat patch to a curious teenager. The lines between age, experience, and pain began to blur, replaced by one truth: they had all carried burdens. And now they were being seen. Cheryl organized a spoken-word event in the evening. The cafe closed early, lights dimmed, and candles lined every table. People stepped up to a small wooden platform near the window and shared poems, letters, or just raw memories. Some could barely finish before emotion overcame them. But no one judged. No one rushed. Tasha listened from the back, her hand resting on Walter's letter folded neatly in her pocket. When her name was called, she hesitated, then stood and walked slowly to the front. She didn't prepare anything. She didn't need to. "I didn't set out to be brave," she began. "I was just tired of watching people pass each other without seeing. That day, I looked at a man and saw hunger. But more than that, I saw grief. I saw someone who had given the best of himself to this country and had gotten silence in return. I just wanted to say with one small act, I see you. I remember you. You still matter." The silence that followed was full, thick with the weight of understanding. She stepped down, and people stood one by one, not with applause, but with nods of solidarity. Outside, the line of visitors hadn't thinned. Volunteers handed out hot coffee and blankets. Musicians played soft hymns near the sidewalk. Walter's picture now rested beneath a framed version of his letter, protected by glass and surrounded by handwritten notes of thanks. That evening, the cafe officially announced that it would host a monthly event called the Walter Table, a free meal night for veterans and the homeless, staffed entirely by volunteers from the town. Donations flooded in. Churches, schools, bakeries, even neighboring cities reached out to offer supplies and funds. Cheryl coordinated everything with military precision, and Lily, now braver than ever, stood at the helm beside Tasha, no longer just serving meals but serving meaning. As night fell and the last candle flickered in the window, Tasha sat alone in the booth where it had all begun. She placed her hand over the glass where Walter's medal lay and whispered, "You're still here. You always will be." And in that moment, Eugene wasn't just a town anymore. It was a testament. A reminder that one plate of food, one small act of courage, could ripple across a nation starving for something deeper than noise. It could feed the soul. Clayton Jenkins hadn't walked down Main Street in a week. Ever since the video went viral and Tasha's name became synonymous with decency, he had chosen to keep a low profile. The last time he'd shown his face in public, someone had shouted at him from across the street, calling him a disgrace. His cafe, once a popular stop for regulars and tourists alike, had become a symbol of callousness. A protest had gathered outside his doors 3 days after Tasha's firing, and though it didn't turn violent, the message was clear: Eugene had turned against him. He tried, for a few days, to keep Riverside Cafe running under his management, but staff members slowly began to quit. First the younger servers, then the cooks, and finally his last remaining dishwasher told him, "I can't serve people here anymore. Not while your name's on the door." Clayton had never felt smaller. At first, he blamed everyone else, the media, the internet, even Tasha. But as the days dragged on in silence, a mirror began forming in his mind, and what he saw in it disturbed him. He saw a man who had valued rules over people, appearances over truth, and profit over humanity. He sat in his dim apartment, staring at a photo from his own military service tucked away in an old cigar box. It was from 1989, long before he opened the cafe. He was in uniform, clean-shaven, full of conviction. But that man felt like a stranger now. He had buried that part of himself under years of bitterness and pride. Seeing Walter on the news, seeing him honored and remembered, brought a sharp, stinging ache to Clayton's chest. He could have recognized that pain in Walter. He could have seen it because he had carried it too. But he hadn't looked close enough. He hadn't wanted to. On Friday morning, Clayton made a decision he hadn't expected to make. He shaved, dressed in clean clothes, and walked toward the new Riverside Cafe. Not the one he owned, but the one that now lived in spirit just down the block in the community center. Tasha, Lily, and Cheryl had reopened it as a volunteer-run space, dedicated to feeding veterans and anyone in need. A banner outside read, "Welcome home," and there was a line around the block. Clayton didn't get in line. He stood to the side, watching quietly. It wasn't until a young boy handed him a flyer that he realized what the event was. Walter's Day, the boy said. You get a free sandwich and write a message to someone who served. Clayton took the flyer slowly. He looked down at it, reading the words in simple, bold font, every act of kindness matters. Especially when no one is watching. Something cracked inside him. For the first time, he didn't try to hide it. He sat on the curb, tucked the flyer in his pocket, and wept. When he finally composed himself, he stood and walked through the community center doors. No one stopped him. Cheryl spotted him first and paused mid-step. Tasha turned from behind the counter where she was assembling sandwiches. Their eyes met, and the room seemed to still. The clamor of plates and conversation faded to a soft hush. Clayton removed his cap and approached the counter. He cleared his throat, but it caught. Tasha, he began, voice ragged, I don't expect you to listen to me. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But I need to say this, because I've carried it too long. Tasha nodded once, letting him speak. I was wrong. Not just for firing you. For forgetting who I used to be. For not seeing what that man needed. For letting fear and money run my life. I've been a coward. His voice trembled with sincerity, the kind that comes when pride finally dies. You showed more strength in a moment than I've shown in years. You reminded people of what matters. And whether you forgive me or not, I needed to come here and say I see that now. I see you. The silence in the room was heavy, but it was not cold. Tasha stepped forward. Her expression didn't soften with pity, nor did it harden with anger. She looked at Clayton the way she'd looked at Walter, that same quiet grace. Thank you for saying it, she said. Not for me. For yourself. Cheryl, from behind, added gently, there's a sandwich waiting if you're hungry. Clayton looked at them both, overwhelmed, then nodded. I'd like that. They didn't make a scene. They didn't snap photos. They simply handed him a plate, and he sat at a corner table, alone, but not shunned. As he ate, he read the notes on the wall. Hundreds of messages from strangers, each thanking someone, each remembering a name long lost. One note caught his eye. It read, forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it can plant something new. After lunch, Clayton quietly approached Lily, who was restocking napkins. If there's any way I can help, he said, even just clean tables. I'd be honored. Lily hesitated, then smiled. We don't need a manager. But we can always use a pair of hands. And so Clayton stayed. That afternoon, he swept the floors and wiped tables with a diligence no one had seen from him before. He didn't ask for recognition. He just did the work. Some volunteers whispered when they saw him. Others stared. But no one sent him away. As the sun set, Clayton walked back to the old cafe building. He stood in front of the locked doors, looking at the closed permanently sign he had posted himself. Then, without a word, he pulled out a key, opened the door, and stepped inside. The place was still as he had left it, tables dusty, chairs askew, silence echoing in corners. He walked to the booth where Walter had once sat and lowered himself into the seat. On the table, someone had left a photograph. Walter, smiling, surrounded by the 4 Marines who had come to his defense. Clayton picked it up, studied it for a long moment, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his old service patch, the same one he'd worn in '89. He set it down beside the photo. Outside, night deepened. Inside, Clayton sat in silence, no longer the man who ran the cafe, but someone starting over. One table. One meal. One truth rediscovered. And now, one man beginning to atone. The phone rang just before noon as the cafe buzzed with its usual rhythm. Cheryl picked it up while balancing a tray of clean mugs, pressing it between her cheek and shoulder. Her "Hello, Riverside Cafe" came out distracted, but what followed made her stop cold. Her eyes widened, the mugs nearly slipping from her grasp. "Yes, sir. Yes, absolutely. We'd be honored," she stammered. The tray clattered to the counter as she covered the receiver and shouted across the room, "Tasha, you need to hear this." Tasha turned from the back prep table, wiping her hands on a towel, her brow furrowing as Cheryl motioned her over with urgency. Cheryl handed her the phone, whispering, "It's a general. A real one." Tasha took the phone cautiously. "This is Tasha," she said, her voice unsure. The man on the other end introduced himself as Lieutenant General Randall Price, retired 3-star Marine Corps commander, now a national advocate for veteran support services. His voice was firm, yet warm, and his words were straightforward. "Miss Melrose, I've followed what's been happening in Eugene. I read Walter Haggerty's letter. I watched the footage of the cafe, the Marines, the way you carried yourself. I want you to know that what you did wasn't just kind. It was military-grade leadership under fire." Tasha didn't know how to respond. Her throat tightened. She had been praised before, but never like this. The general continued, "I'll be in town this week for a veteran policy summit. If it's all right with you, I'd like to stop by your cafe, not as a guest of honor, but as a man who wants to shake your hand." After they hung up, Tasha stood there for a long moment, staring at the receiver like it might ring again. Cheryl blinked at her. "So? He's really coming?" Tasha nodded. "In 3 days." Word spread faster than anyone could have imagined. By nightfall, news stations were setting up interviews, veteran organizations were coordinating a welcome committee, and people were driving in from neighboring states just to be present. The mayor offered to co-host a community reception, but Tasha politely declined. "This isn't about a podium or speeches," she said. "It's about one table, one letter, one town that decided to care again." The morning of the visit arrived with cool skies and a soft breeze. Volunteers lined the sidewalk, setting up chairs and banners. A giant handmade sign stretched above the cafe entrance that read, "Welcome General Price, honoring all who serve." Inside, Cheryl prepped the kitchen like she was feeding royalty, and Lily reorganized the display of veteran photos and medals on the far wall. Tasha, wearing a modest blue blouse and a small flag pin, tried to steady her breath. As the crowd began to form, a black SUV pulled up and the general stepped out. He was older than she expected, tall with broad shoulders, silver hair, and his stern presence softened only by the lines of age around his eyes. He wasn't in uniform, but something about the way he carried himself made it unnecessary. As he walked toward the door, the crowd instinctively fell silent. The general approached Tasha and extended his hand. "Miss Melrose," he said with gravity, "I've saluted presidents and generals, but I've never been prouder to meet someone than I am right now." Tasha took his hand, her voice low. "Thank you, General. But I was just doing what felt right." He looked her straight in the eye. "What feels right doesn't always get done. You did it anyway. That's courage." The general asked to see the booth where Walter had sat. As they walked to it, he passed people who nodded, clapped him gently on the back, or offered a simple, "thank you." He paused at the table, gazing at the photo, the medal, the handwritten notes. He placed his hand on the table, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. He opened it carefully, revealing a service coin, a custom-made medallion bearing the Marine Corps emblem and his own signature etched on the back. He placed it beside Walter's medal. "I met Walter once," he said quietly, addressing those who had gathered. "Decades ago. He saved the lives of 2 of my men during an ambush outside Da Nang. I never knew what happened to him after he left the Corps. Until now." Gasps swept through the crowd as the connection became clear. Tasha's eyes welled. "So that's why this hit home for you," she whispered. The general nodded. "We lose too many. Not just on the battlefield. But after. When they come home and feel like they've disappeared. You brought one of them back. And in doing so, you brought the rest of us with him. He turned to face the room. This isn't just a cafe anymore. It's a lifeline. A monument to what community looks like when it stands up and refuses to look away. The general's visit didn't last long. He sat, signed a few letters, spoke quietly to veterans who approached, and then, before he left, pulled Tasha aside. The Department of Veteran Affairs has launched a new national program. We're selecting a few civilian partners to help lead the community outreach. I want you to be one of them. Tasha blinked, stunned. Me? But I'm not a politician or a leader. You are exactly the kind of leader we need, he interrupted. Someone who doesn't lead for power, but for people. By the time the general's vehicle pulled away, the entire town of Eugene felt like it had changed once again. People didn't just see a viral moment anymore. They saw a movement. The media called it the Eugene effect. Churches launched their own meal nights. Schools held veteran story hours. Entire blocks were adopting homeless veterans into housing programs. Back inside the cafe, Cheryl hugged Tasha so tight her apron bunched. Girl, she said through tears, you're building an army, and all you used was kindness. Tasha laughed gently, her heart full, her eyes glistening. It started with a sandwich, she said. But maybe that was never the whole story. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and golden light filtered through the cafe windows, the photo of Walter sat surrounded by tokens of remembrance and hope. And beside it, the general's coin gleamed. A symbol not of rank, but of respect, for one man who remembered, and one woman who refused to forget. The first Walter table night began quietly. No balloons, no cameras, no speeches. Just an open door, the smell of soup simmering, and a chalkboard sign out front that read, "Veterans and neighbors, your seat is ready." Tasha stood behind the counter with Lily and Cheryl beside her, watching as the first guests arrived. They came slowly at first, an older man with a tattered backpack, a woman in a faded army green jacket, a young man who looked barely out of high school but carried the stillness of someone who had seen more than his age allowed. They each stepped inside hesitantly, glancing around as if unsure they belonged. But Tasha greeted every single one with a smile, a nod of welcome, and a warm plate already waiting. The tables filled quickly. Soon, volunteers were moving in a graceful rhythm, pouring coffee, serving sandwiches, and sharing brief conversations that carried unexpected weight. Cheryl moved like a general of grace, coordinating the flow with a soft authority that calmed nerves and bridged silences. Lily had transformed from shy server to confident host, guiding people to their seats and asking their names with genuine interest. And in the midst of it all, Tasha circulated like a heartbeat, present, attentive, and never too busy to sit down beside someone who needed to talk. Each table held a small card that read, "Your story matters. We're here to listen." And they did listen. The stories that poured out were raw, sometimes fragmented, often painful, but never ignored. One man, an amputee from Iraq, shared how he hadn't sat in a restaurant in over 5 years. Another woman described losing her son to PTSD, her voice breaking as Tasha held her hand. An elderly veteran named Harold said he came just to remember what it felt like to hear his name spoken aloud by someone who didn't need anything from him. The Walter table wasn't just about food. It was about presence. It was about reminding people that they hadn't vanished. That someone still saw them. Still honored what they had carried. Still believed they were worth showing up for. As the evening went on, more people arrived than anyone had expected. Word had spread fast, not through flyers, but through phone calls, quiet mentions at shelters, and whispered encouragements among those living on the edges. The dining area filled, yet no one left. They lingered over empty mugs, sharing laughter with strangers who felt like long-lost brothers. And outside, a line began forming again. Cheryl peeked out the window and gasped. "Tasha, you need to see this." Tasha stepped outside and saw the sidewalk full of civilians, young families, college students, business owners, people who weren't veterans but had come with casseroles, bags of bread, and trays of baked goods. One man held up a sign that read, "We brought food. Let us serve, too." Tasha felt her throat tighten. She opened the doors wider. "Come in," she said. "There's room for all of us." And so they did. Civilians and veterans worked side by side, washing dishes, refilling trays, wiping down tables, laughing in the kitchen. The boundaries between server and served dissolved. The line at the door turned into a wave of participation. Nobody came just to eat. They came to belong. Near closing time, a soft commotion stirred at the entrance. A bus had pulled up, an old, repurposed city bus with a freshly painted sign, Operation Walter. A group of veterans stepped off, some in wheelchairs, others with canes, a few leaning on each other like old soldiers who had marched too many miles together. The bus had come from a shelter 2 counties over, organized by a social worker who had seen Tasha's story online and called every number she could to arrange transport. Tasha rushed forward, helping them inside. Cheryl guided them to the long corner table, now unofficially known as the company seat. Lily brought extra plates. One of the men, a tall, stoic figure with a deep scar across his cheek, looked around and whispered, "This place, it feels like home." The phrase caught in Tasha's chest. That was what she had unknowingly built, a home, not just with walls and chairs, but with dignity. With remembrance. With care. As the last guests trickled out, many leaving notes or small flags on the wall of honor, the team finally sat down to catch their breath. Tasha sank into Walter's booth, exhausted but full. Cheryl leaned on the table beside her. "You realize we didn't close once for 2 hours straight?" Lily nodded, smiling through fatigue. "I've never served that much food in my life." Tasha looked around the room. The tables still buzzed with conversation even as volunteers swept crumbs and stacked chairs. The wall of notes had doubled in size. The general's coin still gleamed under the soft lights beside Walter's medal. She exhaled slowly. "This is more than a cafe now," she said. "It's a promise." Cheryl grinned. A promise kept. Outside, the wind rustled the banner above the door. A group of teenagers who had come to help clean now stood in a circle, talking about starting their own Walter nights at school. Across the street, a homeless man sat with a civilian volunteer, both sipping coffee from to-go cups and trading stories like old friends. The Walter table hadn't emptied. It had expanded. And the town, once fractured by silence and neglect, now pulsed with a single truth: compassion isn't charity. It's responsibility. That night, as Tasha turned off the cafe lights and locked the door, she felt no fear about what came next. Because she knew, with every part of her, that as long as there was a need, the table would never truly be empty. And neither would the hearts of those who had found their way to it. The following winter, the town of Eugene changed in ways no one could have predicted. Snow blanketed the streets in soft silence, but the windows of the new Riverside Cafe glowed warmly into the dusk like a lighthouse for the weary. Every Friday night, rain or shine, the Walter table stood ready. Tasha never missed a night. Neither did Cheryl or Lily. The table had become something more than just wood and chairs. It was now sacred space, where burdens could be laid down without judgment, where eyes met without looking away, and where silence wasn't awkward but healing. On the last Friday before Christmas, the cafe doors opened early. The line outside had started forming around noon, bundled veterans with scarves and coats too thin for the cold. Inside, volunteers moved quickly and joyfully, stringing lights across the ceiling and pinning holiday cards to the honor wall. Cheryl played soft music on the old radio, and Lily passed out cups of peppermint cocoa with candy canes hooked to the rims. Tasha moved through the cafe with a heart so full she could hardly speak. The night held a hum of reverence. There was laughter, yes, but also quiet moments of reflection. A young woman, no more than 20, stood near the corner where Walter's photo still hung, her fingers brushing the frame. She whispered, "My grandfather knew him." Tasha heard and walked over, resting a gentle hand on the woman's back. "So did we," she said. The woman turned, smiling through tears. "Thank you for remembering him." Tasha nodded, not trusting her voice. Later that night, a small girl approached the counter with her mother. She couldn't have been older than 7. She clutched a drawing she'd made, a stick figure in uniform beside a big table filled with smiling faces. "This is the Walter table," she announced proudly. "My daddy said it's where people get loved back to life." The room fell silent, moved by the clarity of a child's words. Tasha crouched down and took the drawing like it was treasure. "That's exactly what it is," she said, her voice trembling. She pinned the drawing beside the general's coin. When the crowd thinned later in the evening, the original 4 Marines who had stood up for Walter returned quietly, slipping in like shadows. They didn't want recognition. They came to sit. To remember. They had formed a kind of brotherhood with the cafe itself, checking in on Tasha every few weeks, sometimes bringing donations, sometimes just dropping off folded flags or notes from other units across the country. That night, they brought a special gift. A plaque carved from walnut, engraved with words Tasha would never forget, "For those who serve with hands, with hearts, and with silence. The fight for dignity has many forms." Tasha ran her fingers over the letters. She could still see Walter sitting there. Quiet. Unassuming. But in his silence, a storm had begun. Not one of destruction, but of redemption. At the end of the evening, just before closing, the cafe dimmed the lights. Cheryl stood near the window and turned off the last overhead bulb. In the soft glow of the Christmas string lights, everyone gathered for one last toast. No wine. No speeches. Just raised coffee cups and nods of gratitude. Tasha stood in the middle of the floor, surrounded by friends and strangers who had all been changed by a single act. "I want to say something," she said quietly, her voice firm but kind. "When this all began, I thought I was just giving a man a sandwich. I didn't know it would become a cause. I didn't know it would change a town. But what I do know now, what I've learned, is that none of this is about grand gestures. It's about small choices. Everyday decisions to see someone, to honor them, to remind them that their story isn't over." She held up her cup. "This table, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every person who ever felt forgotten. And as long as one of us remembers, it will never truly be empty." The crowd murmured in agreement. Eyes shimmered. A veteran in the back whispered, "Semper Fi," and a dozen others echoed him like an oath. After the lights were out and the chairs stacked, Tasha stepped outside. Snow had begun to fall again. Flakes drifted down, catching the golden light spilling from nearby windows. She pulled her coat tighter and walked down Main Street alone, past the bank, the bookstore, the old town hall. And in nearly every window, she saw something new, a photograph of a loved one who had served, a handwritten thank you note, a small flag, a single candle. It wasn't just the cafe anymore. The whole town had become a Walter table. She passed by Clayton's old storefront. It had been converted into a resource center for veterans, staffed by volunteers. The sign above the door read, "Stand by me, a home for every hero." Tasha smiled to herself. She didn't need to go inside. She already knew the work being done. Clayton had found his redemption, not with fanfare, but with mops and dish towels and quiet evenings spent listening. Just like the rest of them. When she reached the church steps where Walter had once slept, she paused. A small statue had been placed there, a bronze figure of a man sitting quietly on a bench, coat buttoned, eyes cast down but peaceful. The plaque read simply, "Walter Haggerty, 1941 to 2023. You were never invisible to us." Tasha sat beside the statue in silence for a few minutes, letting the snowfall cover her shoulders. She didn't cry. She just breathed. Peace had a sound. It was the wind, the quiet crunch of snow beneath boots, the distant murmur of people gathering. It was the sound of a town that had found its heart again. And she had been a part of that, not because she had tried to change the world, but because she had fed one man who hadn't been fed in far too long. When she finally stood and walked home, she knew the cafe would be waiting again tomorrow. The chairs would be set. The coffee would be warm. And the Walter table would be ready. Because some tables never close. Some kindnesses never die. And some names are never forgotten, not when love is louder than silence. And so the story of Tasha, Walter, and a little cafe in Eugene didn't end that winter. It lived on in every hand extended, every chair pulled out for a stranger, and every light that shone in a window for those still trying to find their way home. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?